The morning of January 5, 1942, dawned cold over Tokyo. But inside the war rooms, the air burned with victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before a map of the Pacific, watching as red pins marked Japanese conquests, spreading like wildfire across the ocean. Victory shouts echoed through the capital streets below, raw and electric, the sound of a nation drunk on triumph. But Yamamoto's eyes held something else, something darker. He turned to his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, and his voice came low, deliberate. "Begin preparations," he said. "Second stage operations. I want the plans finished by mid-February." The speed had shocked everyone, even the planners in Tokyo who'd drawn the battle maps. Western Pacific territories were falling faster than dominoes, one after another, crumbling under the imperial war machine. But that speed brought arguments, sharp and bitter, behind closed doors. The ardent nationalists wanted more, always more. Push forward, conquer everything, ride this wave until it crashed against American shores. Admiral Yamamoto wasn't one of them. He'd opposed this war from the beginning, warned anyone who'd listened that taking on the United States was suicide in slow motion. Some said that's why he commanded from the sea now, aboard the flagship Yamato, because friends feared he'd be killed in Tokyo, assassinated by the fanatics who saw his caution as treason. His chief of staff, Ugaki, scribbled in his diary about needing far-sighted statesmanship after this first month of glory, words that echoed Yamamoto's warnings. The admiral had been saying it for months. Japan couldn't win a long war. Not against America, not against Britain. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto met with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. The room smelled of tobacco and whiskey, the air thick with unspoken dread. "War is coming," Yamamoto told him, leaning close. "The politicians have decided, and at first we'll dominate. We'll spread out like an octopus, tentacles everywhere." Now, just 1 month in, that octopus was nearly stretched flat, arms reaching across half the Pacific. But Yamamoto had also told his friend the rest, the part that kept him awake at night. "The euphoria won't last. When Singapore falls, that's when we move. The British will be shaken in India, ready to negotiate. We'll have maybe a year, 18 months at most, to lock in a peace agreement. After that..." He'd left the sentence unfinished, but Sasakawa understood. After that, America's industrial machine would wake up, and Japan would drown in steel and fire. January 5th. The victory did seem close, almost touchable. Pearl Harbor had gutted the American battleship fleet, left it burning in Hawaiian waters. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales were sleeping on the ocean floor off the Malay coast. Manila had fallen, Cavite captured, Hong Kong surrendered. Japanese forces were island-hopping toward the Dutch East Indies, toward Rabaul, toward the Solomons, toward places most Americans couldn't find on a map. But Pearl Harbor hadn't been the total victory Yamamoto needed. The American aircraft carriers had been at sea that morning, untouched, prowling somewhere out there in the dark Pacific like wounded predators. They represented a threat that gnawed at him constantly. He needed something spectacular, something that would bring the Americans to the negotiating table before their industrial power could fully mobilize. Singapore wouldn't fall for another 5 or 6 months by his calculation. It came on February 15th, faster than he'd expected. But to set the stage for negotiations, Yamamoto knew he had to strike somewhere else, somewhere that would shock the world. The question burned in every planning session: where do we hit next? The army immediately vetoed his suggestion to attack the Soviet Union. Such a campaign would be fought on land, and they were already drowning in commitments across China and Southeast Asia. 3 other options emerged from the smoke-filled strategy rooms. Yamamoto's personal favorite was the Indian Ocean. Invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet, destroy it the same way he'd destroyed the Americans at Pearl Harbor, then punch through to the Middle East, link up with the Germans driving toward the Caucasus oil fields. The Navy would have all the oil it could ever need, fuel to keep the war machine running indefinitely. But the Army refused. Too ambitious, too far, too uncertain. Two plans remained on the table. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo pushed for an assault on Australia. Take the Solomons first, then New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, cut off the Americans' forward base. Leave the continent isolated and vulnerable. Imperial General Headquarters was already drawing up occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand, measuring the continent like a suit to be tailored. Yamamoto didn't like it. Too slow, too methodical, not spectacular enough to stop the American momentum. He'd been watching them, studying intelligence reports, reading between the lines. Pearl Harbor hadn't broken their spirit. It had ignited something worse, a hunger for revenge. Even the capture of Singapore wouldn't slow them down now. He needed something bigger, something that would force America to recognize reality, accept a negotiated peace with honor. So in January, Yamamoto ordered another plan drawn up. And 2 months later, officers carried it to Tokyo in leather briefcases. The Me Plan, they called it. A battle off Midway Island where American carriers would sail to their doom. He also sent the AL Plan, detailing an invasion of North America through Alaska, through the Aleutians, a dagger pointed at the American heartland. If everything went perfectly, Hawaii would fall, maybe even the West Coast. At minimum, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would give Japanese politicians the leverage to negotiate the peace Yamamoto desperately wanted. In Tokyo, admirals screamed at each other around polished conference tables in the Navy Ministry, voices rising, fists pounding wood. But in the end, Yamamoto's will prevailed. His reputation, his record, his sheer force of personality bent them to his vision. Forgotten was the strategic significance of Singapore's fall in February. Forgotten was the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purpose. They became irrelevant the moment Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers screamed over Tokyo in April, dropping explosives on the sacred home islands, shattering the illusion of invulnerability. That raid changed everything, shocked the Japanese into understanding that the Americans weren't beaten, weren't negotiating, were just beginning to bare their teeth. June arrived, and with it came disaster at Midway. The operation flamed into catastrophe. 4 fleet carriers gone, sunk beneath the Pacific waves, the cream of Japan's naval aviation lost in a single day. There was no time for finger-pointing, no time for recrimination. The Army didn't even know the full extent of the defeat. The news was carefully suppressed, known only at the highest levels, a secret too terrible to share. While Yamamoto had been gambling everything at Midway, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had been steadily pushing southward, setting up the next phase, the attempt to strangle Australia. Naval forces had taken Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that fortress, they'd been conducting constant reconnaissance and bombing raids against New Guinea and the surrounding islands. It was obvious to the Australians, who communicated their mounting fears to General Douglas MacArthur after his dramatic escape from the Philippines in March. The Japanese would soon strike New Guinea. And if they succeeded there, Northern Australia would be wide open, defenseless. The Japanese had already bombed Darwin in February, sent a message written in fire and shrapnel. In March, when they invaded Salamaua on New Guinea, the pace quickened, the noose tightened. May arrived, and just before Midway, the Japanese sent an occupation force toward Port Moresby. But it was turned back in the fierce carrier battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never saw each other. Everything decided by aircraft launched from decks hundreds of miles apart. The Japanese did manage to occupy Tulagi north of Guadalcanal, built a seaplane base there, another piece on the board. The Battle of the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Australia they had to prepare for the next Japanese move, had to be ready. MacArthur told the Australian government to brace for attack, warned them it would come before any thrust against India. He cabled General Marshall begging for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes, the tools to hold the line. But in Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, had to deliver bad news to General Marshall. Until the end of June, he'd have only 2 working carriers in the entire Pacific. The Japanese had 10. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already sent advanced warning about the big move he expected, which turned out to be Midway. And while that battle raged, the Japanese were establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area, digging in, building up. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua. Naval troops occupied Leh and began constructing an airbase, every day bringing them closer to their ultimate goal. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, Imperial General Headquarters had planned the Port Moresby operation, and Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake was ordered to press toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa to be ready to resume the advance on Port Moresby by July. That would be after Midway, when Yamamoto's combined fleet could be expected to return victorious. That massive carrier force protecting this new southern thrust, despite the disaster at Midway, which was reported to forces in the field as a glorious victory, Imperial General Headquarters didn't alter its plans. Momentum was everything. Victory bred more victory, or so they believed. Days after Midway, Australian intelligence informed General MacArthur the Japanese were preparing to move. In view of what he believed was a Midway victory, MacArthur suggested the Allies make a preemptive strike on the New Britain, New Ireland area, then assault Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air fortress in the region. With 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, MacArthur believed he could force the Japanese back to truck. On June 12th, General Marshall presented MacArthur's plan to Admiral King with some modifications: 3 carriers instead of 2, 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to make the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea immediately, his jaw set, his eyes cold. It would put MacArthur in command of naval forces, something King would rather chew glass than allow. His other reasons were tactical. The carriers would be vulnerable to land-based attack. They wouldn't have enough protection. As it turned out, the Navy had to cope with both problems at Guadalcanal anyway. King devised his own plan: a drive from the New Hebrides by forces under Navy command. MacArthur objected to having Army forces serve under the Navy, but nobody could deny the necessity. The Japanese had to be stopped before they took New Guinea, before they positioned themselves to assault Australia. The problem for the Joint Chiefs of Staff became who would command this critical operation. They split it, gave Phase 1 the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was just a spot on a map then. No known tactical value, didn't even merit a name in the JCS plan. General MacArthur got a consolation prize. After Phase 1, he'd take over and mop up the rest of the Solomons, capture Rabaul, secure New Guinea. Admiral King got his way because the Joint Chiefs recognized he'd already planned a defensive line down the Pacific to protect Australia. His plan required relatively less force than MacArthur's grand design. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had convinced General Arnold to send several squadrons of Army Air Force planes there. He'd reinforced Samoa and Efate in the New Hebrides, planned to establish a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness at Wake Island had infuriated King, was quietly shipped off to a newly created unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were told to develop new techniques for island warfare, figure out how to take beaches defended by determined enemies. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested the first effort had to be holding the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces. Second stage would be a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. Third stage would involve seizing the Caroline and Marshall Islands. Fourth stage would take the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines, eventually Tokyo itself. Admiral King approved the plan without hesitation. It was exactly what he'd envisioned. He made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the plan's division, told him to get ready to take over as commander of the amphibious operation. All this was set in motion even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Planning and counter-planning, moving pieces on a vast oceanic chessboard. Vice Admiral Gormley left Washington on May the 1st, would take command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th, but first he had to report to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already beginning in the South Pacific. On May 22nd, an Army plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft taking pictures of Guadalcanal, methodically photographing the terrain. Army intelligence suggested the Japanese were preparing to build an airfield there, turning this forgotten island into a forward base. On June 25th, Army intelligence reported the grass on the island's central plain had been burned off. Tents had appeared. A wharf was under construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal, hidden in the jungle, risked his life to report that construction of an airfield was only awaiting the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew the designations, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, the equivalent of American CB units. This information was confirmed by a radio interception at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence group had cracked parts of the Japanese naval code, picked up a message saying the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th. Fleet intelligence connected the dots. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day, on his way to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report and showed it to Turner, the Admiral knew immediately where he was going. It could be nowhere but the Solomons, nowhere but Guadalcanal. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, boarding his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His task seemed impossible. Train an entire amphibious task force in 1 month, teach them everything they needed to know to survive an opposed beach landing. As Turner scrambled to organize ships and men, Admiral Gormley was traveling to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley left New Zealand with his head swimming in gloomy thoughts about the foolishness of attempting an amphibious operation when nobody knew how to execute one properly. When the troops were green, the equipment untested, the coordination uncertain. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the Navy's plan, agreed with him entirely, fed his pessimism. They also agreed that with the aircraft available, they couldn't guarantee the landing's sufficient air coverage, couldn't promise the troops wouldn't be slaughtered on the beaches. This meeting occurred on July 8th, and the landings were scheduled for 3 weeks later. Together, they sent a dispatch back to Washington recommending the operation be deferred, postponed, reconsidered. Admiral King read that message, and his blood turned to ice, then fire. King had warned his new commander he was handing him a difficult assignment, told him he wouldn't be able to provide proper tools until perhaps the fall. But King's answer came back swift and unequivocal. No, the invasion would proceed as planned. No delays, no excuses. Gormley had left Washington convinced the United States wasn't ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom increased with every obstacle he encountered. Every request denied, every shortage discovered. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was plagued by intelligence failures and logistical nightmares. All concerned commands knew an operation was coming, especially after July 10th, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his operations orders. The major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, then bomb Australia into submission. There was no doubt they could strike a deadly blow at the Allied buildup. But on July 10th, Allied intelligence reports reaching King contained only a casual mention about airfield construction at Guadalcanal. And days later, a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. Fundamental errors that could cost lives. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield, smooth and ready. And back at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission would leave Rabaul on August 14th, never suspecting the Americans would arrive first. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley tried desperately to secure more resources, build advanced bases, bring in additional aircraft, but everywhere he turned, he learned the harsh truth of Admiral King's warning about inadequate tools. The supplies for the invasion forces, for example, were loaded haphazardly aboard transports at Oakland, thrown in without thought to the order they'd be needed. There were plenty of docks at Oakland. Ships could have been unloaded and reloaded properly. Supplies organized for efficient use. Instead, the ships were sent to Noumea, which had no such facilities, and chaos ensued. Admiral King had at least a general understanding of the difficulties, but there wasn't time for delay. Time was the one resource they couldn't manufacture. King knew better than any subordinate the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they reached Australia. The timetable was fixed in blood and necessity. By late July, the rush intensified, became frantic. 17,000 Marines were moving by troop ship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa, converging on a single point in the South Pacific. Admiral Gormley was too busy managing the chaos to hold a conference of his commanders. But on July 26th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was supposed to be in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders gathered in one room to discuss the invasion they'd execute in less than 2 weeks. Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his carrier task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandegrift to the beach. Once the Marines secured the island, garrison troops would be brought in. But the operation had been called so hastily that nobody had made provisions for reserve forces. There were no additional troops available anywhere in the South Pacific. They were committing everything to this single throw of the dice. The meeting on the Saratoga was tense, uncomfortable, marked by disagreement from the start. Fletcher began by announcing he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days, insisted the carriers must not be risked beyond that time frame. Gormley's staff members at the meeting concurred nervously, nodding agreement. Fletcher was gun-shy, convinced the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, doomed to failure. Admiral Turner, who understood the global military picture better than anyone else in that cabin, chided his superior officer gently but firmly. There was no point in that sort of defeatist argument, he said, his voice steady. The decision had been made at the highest levels to risk everything. Their job now was to carry out orders, not question them. Fletcher should have known all that after the Coral Sea, after Midway. Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant reluctance to engage that he'd insisted Admiral Nimitz personally assess the man's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a kindly soul who liked Fletcher personally, had given him a pep talk. And when Midway was won, Fletcher had been in command, so he couldn't be faulted for the victory. But now, on the eve of the first American offensive operation in the Pacific War, to warn the troops and support ships that he planned to abandon them after 48 hours was the most inauspicious beginning imaginable, a shadow cast over everything that would follow. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was staged on July 28th, lasted 3 days, took place at Coro Island near Fiji. It was a disaster. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they stumbled around confused, unsure of objectives, unable to coordinate with supporting units. General Vandegrift watched the chaos and regarded the exercise as a complete bust, a failure on every level. But there was no time to second-guess, no time to train properly, no time to fix the problems. On July 31st, the Marines climbed back aboard the transports, and the fleet turned its bow toward Guadalcanal, toward history. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers, taking them as far from harm as possible while still technically providing the air coverage he'd promised. The 26 ships of the carrier group steamed away, and if American intelligence had been faulty enough to permit the Japanese buildup at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even worse, because as the United States invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, concentrated in overwhelming force, the Japanese had absolutely no idea an attack was coming. In July 1942, the Japanese army was consumed with capturing New Guinea as a staging point for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buna, captured the settlement, then planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a renewed assault on Port Moresby. Japanese air power concentrated against Port Moresby throughout July. Bombers and fighters sweeping over the piers and airfields almost daily, pounding them relentlessly. After the Japanese landings, the air forces were also called on to support the beachhead. And in early August, their attention remained fixed on the new drive southward. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored peacefully at Hashirajima in Japanese waters, the admiral preparing in leisurely fashion for forthcoming air operations over Australia, planning the next moves in what seemed an endless string of victories. In preparation, on August 3rd, the naval air groups stationed at Lae were brought back to Rabaul to be ready for Guadalcanal operations that would begin the following week. Routine movements for what they believed would be another routine mission. During the first week of August, the South Pacific skies remained cloudy, overcast, and only a handful of Japanese search planes ventured out. None of them found the American armada steaming steadily toward Guadalcanal, hidden beneath weather and fortune. Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were occasionally surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buna. They'd been told the United States carriers were destroyed at Midway, sunk out of the war. The pilots assumed incorrectly that the carriers must be operating with Australian forces that had marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains, never suspecting the truth. Actually, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion, practicing the attack runs they'd make in days. Nobody in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected a forthcoming invasion was imminent. After 8 months of continuous victories, one triumph after another, it had become impossible for the Japanese to believe the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion, especially this soon. Had the idea been suggested at a staff meeting, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an invasion had almost no chance of success, was tactically unsound, strategically premature. So as the American Expeditionary Force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed the precious element of surprise, the one advantage that might tip the balance. On August 4th and 5th, the 75 ships steamed forward under an overcast sky, invisible from above. On August 6th, the fleet moved through rain squalls almost all day long, nature providing cover where luck had failed before. But as dawn rose on the morning of August 7th, the sky cleared. Broken clouds scattered across a brightening horizon, which meant carrier planes would have perfect visibility for their attacks, could see their targets clearly. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30 a.m., alarm bells clanging, men rushing to battle stations, the nervous energy of impending combat charging the air. At 6:00 a.m., the carriers launched their first strike. Planes roaring off flight decks, engines screaming, propellers biting air. Planes from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo. two small islands connected by a causeway, and Japanese planes had been grounded the day before by bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force had reported one unidentified aircraft during the previous day, but whether it was Japanese or one of General MacArthur's planes remained undetermined. In any event, the Japanese weren't aroused, weren't alerted, remained blissfully unaware until 6:12 a.m. when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi Seaplane Base sent a frantic message, crackling with urgency, announcing the attack. The radio message shot out to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, reached Admiral Yamamoto and Imperial headquarters in seconds. Simple and succinct. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The words hung in the air like smoke. Weather had cleared, and carrier planes flew off into scattered cumulus clouds in the light of a quarter moon, silvery and pale. The fighters and bombers moved toward their appointed targets, history unfolding beneath their wings. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal, hunting for aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, supply dumps, anything that could resist. They found no aircraft, no PT boats, just buildings and supplies. So they strafed what they could see, raking the structures with machine gun fire. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained combat air patrol over the transport area from 6 until 8 a.m., when they were replaced by fresh planes, keeping the sky covered. Bombers began hitting Tulagi and the Lunga Point area methodically, but no enemy air activity was detected all morning. The Americans had the sky entirely to themselves. The only losses were planes damaged in operational accidents, landing gear failures, rough carrier landings. Planes from the other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavatu with devastating effect. The surprise was absolute, total. American planes arrived and began bombing and strafing the seaplanes floating in the water like sitting ducks, helpless targets. They destroyed 9 float planes similar to the Zero, 1 massive 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that doubled as search planes and bombers, wiping out the entire unit. A few Japanese pilots tried desperately to take off, scrambling into cockpits, starting engines, but they were shot down before they cleared the water, planes exploding in flames and spray. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the morning attack. The base was erased as an operational threat. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck targets on the beaches where Marines would soon land, softening defenses, creating chaos. Before dawn, the Marines crowded on the decks of transports could see the high mountains of the island that was their objective. Dark silhouettes against a lightening sky. The transports slipped quietly through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sealark Channel, moving into position. As dawn rose fully, the guns of escorting warships opened fire, muzzle flashes illuminating the fleet like lightning. There was virtually no answering fire from shore. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. The bombardment from cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troop ships started fires along the shoreline. An oil dump exploded spectacularly, sending flames leaping into the sky, black smoke billowing. At 8 a.m., after 2 hours of relentless bombing and shelling, the landing craft began their runs toward the north shore east of Lunga Point, engines churning water into white foam. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had practical experience in an opposed landing. This was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War decades earlier, ancient history. At 9 a.m., troops were splashing ashore on Guadalcanal, boots hitting sand and coral, weapons ready. And they met absolutely no resistance because the Japanese had fled into the interior hills, vanished into the jungle. The going was ridiculously easy at first, almost anticlimactic. The Marines soon discovered how completely they'd surprised the enemy. The evidence was everywhere. They came across wooden barracks that had never been occupied, materials still stacked nearby, They found a tent with a breakfast table covered with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums, still warm, steam rising. Half-filled rice bowls were scattered around. Chopsticks hastily dropped on tables or straw mats covering the floor. The tents themselves told the story of why the Japanese had abandoned their meal so quickly. They were torn by shrapnel, some knocked completely flat by naval shells that had landed during the pre-landing bombardment. But any Marine who felt like celebrating the easy advance, who thought this would be a walkover, had terrible shocks awaiting him across the water. It was true the Japanese on Guadalcanal had been surprised, hadn't dug proper fortifications yet, hadn't created the defensive positions they needed, mostly because the men there were construction troops, laborers, not dedicated combat soldiers. But over on Tulagi, the situation was entirely different, brutally so. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines encountered fierce, determined resistance almost immediately. About 250 Japanese were dug in on Tulagi. Troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki, experienced soldiers, dedicated fighters who would die before surrendering. Edson's 1st Raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific Theater. Every man a volunteer chosen from the ranks of an already elite force renowned for fighting qualities. The Raider concept had emerged from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for creating a commando force. Carlson's experience included months of service with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla struggles against Japanese forces in North China, learning tactics the hard way. Edson's Raiders had trained for months under Spartan conditions, pushed beyond normal limits, and when they arrived at Guadalcanal, they carried a powerful reputation. As it turned out, they'd need every skill they'd learned and would acquire new ones written in blood. This invasion represented the first major contact between highly trained American forces and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war had exploded in December. The Japanese had built a terrifying reputation through their phenomenally rapid conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies, victories that seemed almost supernatural. For months, Tokyo had trumpeted its triumphs, and half the world had come to believe the Japanese were invincible, unstoppable, a reputation Imperial High Command was pleased to cultivate and expand. Tulagi then became the first real testing ground, where myth would meet reality. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern section of the island. And initially, the advance didn't seem much harder than Guadalcanal across the channel. They encountered resistance from a few scattered outposts, small firefights that ended quickly. The northwestern part of Tulagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees tangled with vines and bougainvillea, with its beautiful purple leaves and viciously sharp thorns that tore uniforms and skin. At first, terrain seemed to be the worst obstacle, nature more dangerous than the enemy. Edson lost only one man in the initial landing, that soldier killed by a sniper's bullet as the Marines hit the beach, a single crack echoing across the water. Edson's plan was straightforward: move inland to a ridge running the length of the island, then advance along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes systematically as they moved south, textbook tactics. But the terrain proved so difficult, so treacherous, that it consumed 3 hours just to chop through 1.5 miles of rising ground, machetes hacking vines, men struggling uphill. Having finally reached the ridgeline, the Marines pushed ahead confidently, emerged from the jungle's edge into open ground, and ran straight into the central Japanese defenses built cunningly on the hillside, positions they hadn't known existed. The Japanese had constructed elaborate dugouts and rock embrasures, placed machine guns with meticulous care to create interlocking fields of fire, overlapping kill zones. The Japanese defense philosophy was based on keeping attackers below them, using height and prepared positions to maximum advantage. But the Marines discovered that by crawling up the cliffs from unexpected angles, They could drop charges of dynamite and grenades directly into the dugouts from above, turning the defensive advantage against itself. That became the brutal method they employed to advance, yard by bloody yard. Once a dugout was blown apart, shattered, it still wasn't safe to approach. In one position, the Americans killed 17 Japanese soldiers with dynamite charges, bodies blown apart, the smell of cordite and blood thick in the air. One Marine spotted a radio inside the smoking crater and went in to retrieve it, thinking the position was cleared. There were still 2 Japanese soldiers alive in the darkness, wounded but conscious, and they shot him and another man who came rushing after him before they were finally killed. A lesson learned in American blood. One section of Marines took on the central defense position, while the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed steadily down the ridge. But even along the ridgeline, the going remained treacherous, deadly. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon alone, men falling to bullets and shrapnel, screaming for corpsmen. The frontal resistance was fierce enough, but with Japanese defenders, frontal attacks were only half the nightmare. Snipers seemed to materialize everywhere, tied with rope in trees, hidden in the tops of buildings, concealed behind rocks and fallen logs, patient as death itself. A favorite Japanese tactic was letting the forward element of a Marine unit pass unmolested, then opening fire from behind, shooting men in the back, creating chaos and confusion. This maneuver almost always meant death for the sniper eventually, but usually not before he'd caused multiple casualties, traded his life for several Americans. One thing the first Raiders learned definitively that day was that the small 6.5mm Japanese rifle and machine gun rounds were more likely to wound than kill outright, which from the Japanese tactical point of view was entirely satisfactory, since caring for wounded men consumed additional troops and resources, degraded combat effectiveness. During the afternoon, the Raiders drove relentlessly along the ridge until they reached a 3-sided ravine, whose floor was an old British cricket field, flat and open, surrounded by steep walls. The Japanese had dug extensively into those ravine walls, established murderous fields of fire covering every approach. As Marines moved forward toward the cricket ground, they ran directly into devastating crossfire. Bullets coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Edson halted the advance because darkness was approaching fast, and this was absolutely no time to be probing unknown dangers in fading light. That was how units got massacred. That night, the Marines on Tulagi experienced another brutal education in Japanese tactics, something that would haunt American forces throughout the Pacific campaign. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered with virtually no chance of survival or reinforcement, staged one of the desperate, death-driven counterattacks for which they would become infamous. Attacks that defied Western military logic. They waited patiently until the Marine perimeter grew quiet, men settling into foxholes, exhaustion weighing on them. Then, at 10:30 p.m., they struck with savage fury, broke through the line between 2 companies in a screaming charge, surrounded one entire unit, cut it off completely. The Marines fought desperately in their foxholes and in the open, using rifles, machine guns, grenades, knives, anything they could grab. Hand-to-hand combat in darkness lit only by muzzle flashes. The Japanese surged along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post, got within 50 yards of him before the Americans rallied, every officer and clerk grabbing weapons. Finally, the Marines overpowered the attackers and threw them back in brutal close-quarters fighting. But not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers, the experienced sergeants and corporals who held units together. The next day, August 8th, more troops were landed on Tulagi until there were 7,500 Americans on that side of Sea Lark Channel, reinforcements pouring in. Edson's Raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines began advancing again toward the southeastern end of the island, moving methodically. One by one, they attacked the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep sides of the old cricket ground. each position a separate battle. From one cave, they removed 35 dead Japanese, some bodies already rotting and stinking in the tropical heat, but some killed in the very last moments of the position's defense, fresh corpses still warm. From this grim discovery, the Americans deduced correctly that Japanese tactical doctrine was to hold every position until the absolute last moment, unless specifically ordered to retreat. Proof of the iron discipline of the Japanese armed forces, a discipline that made them terrifyingly effective defenders. Those troops who did surrender on Guadalcanal were mostly members of labor battalions, construction workers, not combat soldiers trained to die rather than yield. The raiders that second day encountered dozens of examples of a warrior spirit they'd never witnessed before in any enemy. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who at the end possessed only one loaded pistol among them, down to their last ammunition. As the Marines prepared for the final assault, moving into position, they heard 3 sharp shots echoing from inside the dugout. When they cautiously entered, they discovered 3 bodies and 1 empty pistol lying on the ground. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then systematically shot his 2 companions through the head, and finally himself, choosing death over the dishonor of capture. In those first days of combat, this suicidal mentality shocked the Marines profoundly. It was extraordinarily difficult for an American to comprehend how cornered or wounded men with absolutely no hope of survival, knowing the enemy possessed overwhelming material and numerical superiority, would almost invariably choose death over surrender, would fight literally until their last breath. It required mental adjustment, a recalibration of expectations. But after several Japanese soldiers had pretended to surrender only to pull out concealed pistols or bayonets to attack their would-be captors, or to detonate grenades clutched to their chests to kill themselves and nearby Americans, the Marines adapted, took the Japanese on their own merciless terms. Thereafter, there were virtually no further attempts to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender, both sides understanding the war would be fought to extermination. Tulagi was brought under relative control on that second day, although not every Japanese soldier on the island had been killed. Some remained hidden in caves and jungle. For days afterward, Japanese snipers continued to harass American troops, taking shots from concealment, until the very last sniper was hunted down and killed, the island finally secured. One gets a vivid sense of the stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi from the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss, a tough career Marine who'd seen action before. He'd moved ahead of his squad to attack a cave position near the cricket field. The Japanese had been firing sporadically from that hole, making any advance impossible. He maneuvered close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave entrance, and Marines had been trained thoroughly to pull the pin of the egg-shaped grenade. Throw it hard, count slowly, and hear the explosion that confirmed the kill. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, threw the grenade, counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and, incredibly, the grenade came flying back out of the cave, lobbed by a Japanese soldier inside. He had to dive and roll to escape the blast of his own weapon, shrapnel whistling over his head. After another identical experience, the grenade coming back out like a deadly game of catch, he adapted his technique, held the grenade for 3 long seconds after pulling the pin, then threw it. He counted 4, 5, 6, and unbelievably, out it came again. The Japanese soldier inside exhibiting inhuman reflexes and courage. Sergeant Goss, frustrated and furious, called for a satchel charge, a canvas bag packed with dynamite usually reserved for demolishing buildings and fortifications. He thrust the primed charge into the cave entrance and sprinted back. The Japanese soldier inside thrust it back out toward the Americans with desperate strength. The dynamite exploded massively, and the concussion drove a jagged rock splinter deep into Goss's leg, blood soaking through his trousers. The wound wasn't serious enough to incapacitate him, but it hurt enough and infuriated him enough that rage overcame caution. He grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, charged directly into the cave entrance, spraying fire in wild arcs, bullets ricocheting off stone walls. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers caught in the open and counted 8 others who had died earlier from grenades and gunfire, 12 men total in one small cave, fighting to the absolute end. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was even worse than Tulagi, more concentrated, more vicious. The landings there came in the middle of the morning. Not many troops were initially committed because intelligence suggested minimal Japanese presence. But since the seaplane base was located on these connected islands, the Japanese had heavily fortified both, and the Marines ran headlong into a buzzsaw. The Japanese were surprised initially, still recovering from the bombardment and aerial attacks that had obliterated their seaplanes. So the first wave of Marines landing encountered only scattered rifle fire, sporadic resistance. But by the time the second wave reached the beach, the Japanese had organized their defense about 500 yards inland, and the fire became intense, withering, coordinated. The third wave came under devastating fire before their landing craft even reached shore, bullets churning the water, and casualties mounted rapidly, men falling in the boats. Gavutu and Tanambogo were both dominated by small hills, not quite 150 feet high, but elevated above the sea-level landing beaches. That height provided commanding fields of fire. The Japanese had constructed their defensive positions expertly along the slopes, well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and massive quantities of ammunition. As on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be taken individually. They absolutely refused to retreat, and the viciousness of fighting on Tanambogo was almost unbelievable in its intensity, beyond anything the Marines had trained for. In the early assault waves, the Marines had successfully landed several light tanks, rumbling off landing craft onto the beach. The Japanese immediately swarmed toward the Tanambogo dock, where the landings were concentrated. They jammed crowbars viciously under the tank treads, trying to immobilize them, threw grenades at vision ports, tried desperately to set the tanks ablaze with gasoline-soaked rags stuffed into engine vents. One tank commander opened his hatch to employ the tank's external machine gun against the attackers and personally killed 23 Japanese soldiers in close range, fighting before one enemy soldier scrambled up the side of the tank like a monkey and stabbed him repeatedly, to death with a bayonet thrust through the open hatch. Another Japanese soldier then threw gasoline-soaked burning rags inside the tank, and it became an inferno, the crew burning alive, screams echoing inside steel walls. By mid-afternoon on this brutal first day, it became apparent the Marines desperately needed reinforcements, were being ground down. A unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where there were no Japanese forces, was hurriedly called across the water to assist in taking Tanambogo. The island had been secured by then, but the Marines remained unable to secure the narrow causeway linking the two small islands. It was swept by constant fire. The reinforcements were ordered to land on Tanambogo at dusk and were given exactly 5 minutes of preparatory naval bombardment to soften defenses. Unluckily, tragically, one of the very last shells struck a fuel dump near the beach and ignited it. Flames shot skyward and lit up the entire shoreline as brilliantly as noon, turning night into day. As the Marines approached in their landing craft, the Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the burning sea from their elevated dugout positions on the hills. Perfect targets. From those concealed positions came a steady, methodical stream of machine gun and rifle fire, tracer rounds drawing lines of light through darkness. 2 boatloads of Marines managed to reach the beach, men scrambling over the sides into shallow water. But the coxswain of the third boat was killed instantly at his tiller by a bullet through the head, and the boat slewed wildly around leaderless and headed back out to sea, engines still running. The following boats, seeing this, assumed there had been some change in orders, some signal they'd missed, and they turned back as well, leaving the men from the first 2 boats completely stranded ashore. Their only protection was the concrete pier jutting into the water. They huddled behind it desperately. As soon as the pinned-down Americans returned fire at the hillside positions, the Japanese spotted their exact locations by the muzzle flashes and tracer rounds, concentrated fire on those positions. Soon, several Marines were down, wounded or dead, bleeding on coral and sand. One boat returned under heavy fire, managed to evacuate some of the wounded, then retreated, and it was considerable time before the confusion was sorted out, and other boats began landing reinforcements in the correct locations. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a fierce counterattack directly on the beach, screaming charges down from the hills. Captain Crane, the officer leading the stranded unit, was cut off from his boat during the chaos, and he and 5 enlisted men hid desperately in thick brush. In the darkness, moving carefully, they managed to escape back to the beach after the Japanese had withdrawn to their hillside positions, melting back into defensive positions. Eventually, they were extracted alive, but it wasn't until 4 a.m. on the morning of August 8th before another full unit landed successfully and was finally able to secure the causeway, linking the 2 islands under American control. When the fighting started on the connected islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo, there were approximately 500 Japanese defenders dug into the coral and rock. When the fighting finally ended days later, there were exactly none left alive. The islands had become a mass grave. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station operator, realizing what was happening, flashed the first desperate word of the United States assault directly to Rabaul, the message crackling through the air. The astounding, almost unbelievable news reached Rabaul Airfield just as pilots of the morning missions were preparing to take off for another routine day's harassment of Australian forces on New Guinea. Engines warming up, orders were immediately cancelled on the spot, and all available aircraft were frantically dispatched to strike the American invasion fleet before it could consolidate. Every plane that could fly. Before the planes could actually take off, they received additional unwelcome news from Tulagi, transmitted in final gasps. The entire flying boat flotilla based there had been completely destroyed, wiped out. Then radio contact with Tulagi was abruptly broken, went silent, which could only mean the base had been overrun entirely. Lost. At 8:30 a.m., a formation of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers roared down the Rabaul runway and lifted into tropical air. They'd been loaded for the planned strike against Australian forces on New Guinea, so they carried conventional bombs instead of the torpedoes that would have been more effective against ships. But there was no time to rearm. 18 Zero fighters accompanied them as escort, climbing to 13,000 feet, then flew east to Buka Island and turned south along the Bougainville coast, heading toward the target. They were picked up and spotted by 4 Enterprise fighter planes just after 1 p.m. in the afternoon, the American Combat Air Patrol doing its job. The Enterprise Wildcats were flying at 18,000 feet when far below them they spotted the large formation of Betty bombers with Zero escorts positioned just above the bombers. Just above Florida Island, the F-4Fs attacked aggressively, diving from altitude, and Lieutenant V.P. Dupois shot down 1 bomber immediately. 4 others began trailing smoke heavily and were listed as probable kills. But after this initial successful diving pass, the Zeros joined the fight with vengeance, and the outmatched F-4Fs broke off combat to take refuge in cloud cover as they'd been specifically instructed to do by intelligence officers who knew the Wildcats' limitations. Against the superior Zero, they'd been hit hard in the brief engagement. 1 F-4F had been shot down in flames, and Lieutenant Dupois' plane was so badly shot up, riddled with holes, that he had to make an emergency landing on the carrier Wasp, his own carrier too far away. Lieutenant G.E. Fairbank led another flight of 6 Wildcat fighters from the Enterprise, and they found the enemy formation off Santa Isabel Island, intercepted them. The Zeros came in fast and aggressive, 10 of them in tight formation, and attacked 3 of the American fighters simultaneously. All 3 F-4Fs were shot down quickly, spinning into the sea trailing smoke, the Zeros' superiority brutally demonstrated. The other 3 American fighters attacked the bomber formation desperately, and Ensign R.A.M. Dibb shot down 1 Betty bomber in flames. The first confirmed kill of a Zero fighter that day was made by radio electrician 3rd Class T.W. Rhodes, an enlisted pilot, proof that courage wasn't limited to officers. But the Zeros came after the remaining Americans in overwhelming force, and the F-4Fs ducked into clouds to hide and survive. There were 10 Zeros hunting them in 2 tight formations. The Japanese observed their tactical rule religiously: never let your wingman out of sight. They attacked the F-4Fs from the starboard quarter in coordinated passes. Lieutenant Fairbank, enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson, Jr., and pilot machinist W.H. Warden were all shot down in the vicious fight that followed, planes exploding or cartwheeling into the ocean. One of the Australian coast watchers, those brave men hidden in the islands, picked up Fairbank from the water off Santa Isabel Island, saved his life. A Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden off that same island, pulled him from the surf. But Stevenson was never found, presumably killed in the crash or drowned, another name for the casualty lists. Aboard the other American carriers, the story played out similarly. A grinding aerial battle. The Japanese bombers proved to be much easier targets than the nimble Zeros. 6 fighters from Fighter Squadron 323 ran into enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them in quick succession. Machinist D.C. Runyon destroyed 2 single-handedly with accurate gunnery, his tracers finding fuel tanks. Just after 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, when the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their attack run over the island, coast watchers were already on alert, doing their dangerous job. Paul Edward Mason, a copra planter in peacetime now serving as a coast watcher, was stationed on Malabita Hill on Bougainville overlooking Buin Harbor. At 9:02 a.m. that morning, he'd transmitted a crucial message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading southeast toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles distant, roughly 2¼ hours of flying time from the target. When that vital message was broadcast from Mason's hidden position and relayed through Pearl Harbor back to the invasion fleet, it reached the American ships with plenty of time for preparations. Gun crews manning stations, fighters launching. The reaction aboard HMS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers supporting the invasion, was typically laconic. When the warning came through, the bosun's mate piped the message matter-of-factly. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 who, treating imminent combat as a scheduling issue. The torpedo bombers came in precisely on schedule. Japanese punctuality even in war. The United States fighters climbed above the incoming formation to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal and looked down on the invasion fleet spread across the water, a target-rich environment. At noon exactly, American carrier fighters and the anti-aircraft guns of the ships were ready and waiting for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were feeling the brutal results of American counterattack, meeting real resistance. The American fighter planes proved quite effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal, all but 1 was shot down, spinning into the sea or exploding in midair. And the only damage sustained in that first determined attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which took a bomb hit that killed several sailors but didn't sink her. Against the Zero fighters, however, the story remained different, still difficult. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace with dozens of kills, was among those 18 Zeros chosen specifically for their skill to make this first long-range mission over the distant target, the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The Japanese fighter force was jumped aggressively by F-4F Wildcats from the American carriers, and the Wildcats went straight for the bombers initially, ignoring the Zeros, following their tactical doctrine. The Zeros protected their bombers as effectively as they could, then turned to engage the American fighters in swirling dogfights. Sakai, an experienced and highly skilled pilot, was initially puzzled by American tactics. They seemed strange. The Navy pilots dove against the Zeros with speed and aggression, but if they missed on the first slashing pass, they immediately scattered and evaded, rather than turning to dogfight. They'd been instructed well by intelligence officers who thoroughly understood that the Zero was vastly superior in turning and climbing ability, and was also faster in level flight. Trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide. After a grim and skillful aerial battle, Sakai personally shot down one F-4F Wildcat and an SBD Dauntless dive bomber that foolishly jumped 4 Zeros by itself, was immediately overwhelmed. Several other Japanese pilots scored kills as well, while only 1 Zero was lost in the engagement, shot down in flames. Pilot Sakai then made a near-fatal mistake, attacked what he thought was a group of F-4F fighters, came in fast and aggressive, and ran straight into a formation of SBD torpedo bombers, realizing his error too late. He flew directly into 4 spitting 50-caliber machine guns manned by alert rear gunners who had him perfectly framed as he approached. They caught him cold. His Zero was badly smashed by the concentrated fire. The cockpit shattered, and he was seriously wounded, blood filling the cockpit, his vision failing. Yet through sheer skill and willpower, he managed to fly the crippled plane all the way back to Rabaul, nearly 600 miles, and somehow landed it before collapsing unconscious in the cockpit, more dead than alive. In the air combat that day, the Japanese still maintained a temporary advantage in the superior quality and performance of the Zero fighter. It remained the best carrier fighter in the Pacific. But already, the Americans in their rugged F-4F Wildcats were beginning to learn tactical methods to exploit the Zero's limitations, to use the enemy's strengths against him, adapting and surviving. The matter of control of the air was obviously going to be hotly contested in the months ahead, a battle within the battle. At this particular moment, the Americans enjoyed the crucial advantage of proximity, with carriers positioned close offshore providing rapid air support. But the Japanese possessed the advantage of superior numbers concentrated at Rabaul, hundreds of aircraft available, and the American effort remained seriously hampered by the technical superiority of the Japanese Zero over the American Wildcat fighter in almost every performance category. The carrier pilots were flying the F-4F Wildcat, which was demonstrably not as fast or as maneuverable as the legendary Zero. The Japanese could fly circles around them in turning fights. The one significant advantage the F-4F possessed was its incredibly sturdy construction and armor protection for the pilot. It could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero. That ruggedness was all that kept the ratio of aircraft losses as favorable as it was for the Americans in these early engagements. American planes coming home with hundreds of bullet holes still flying. At Rabaul, the Japanese recovered rapidly from the initial surprise and shock of the American invasion, began organizing a systematic response. But the critical problem for Japanese fighters remained the punishing 100-mile round trip from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back. It was at the absolute edge of the Zero's range. For that reason, on the first day of combat, Commander Nakajima, the aggressive leader of the fighter squadron, had resisted furious demands by higher authority that every available Zero be thrown immediately into the fight, had insisted on dispatching only his most experienced and skilled flyers who had the best chance of surviving the mission and returning. He would soon be forced to send less experienced pilots, younger men, and the losses would grow increasingly serious, largely because of the vast distances to be traversed and the fuel management required. Many Zeros would simply run out of fuel on the return flight and crash into the sea. By nightfall of the first day, August 7th, the United States invasion seemed reasonably secure, the beachhead established. American troops had advanced steadily toward the nearly completed airfield and had not encountered any substantial organized resistance, just scattered snipers. One Japanese prisoner was captured alive, interrogated, and he indicated nervously that there were only about 600 combat troops on the entire island and approximately 1,400 laborers, and that they'd all fled in panic to the opposite side of the island, hiding in the jungle interior. Admiral Turner had successfully moved 11,000 Marines ashore, and vast piles of ammunition, food rations, medical supplies, and other equipment crowded the beaches in chaotic stacks, more supplies than could be organized. General Vandegrift had noticed with growing concern that the beach force was completely unable to properly organize and distribute the supplies efficiently. But fearing that Fletcher's carriers would soon withdraw as threatened, he was glad to see supplies still flowing ashore even if improperly stacked. He established a second beachhead to relieve congestion, but it soon became as badly crowded and disorganized as the first, a logistical nightmare forming. At 8:40 a.m. on the morning of August 8th, Coastwatcher Jack read at Buka. Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kavieng and were heading south. Transmitted the warning immediately. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor's communication center repeated and relayed the broadcast to the ships off Guadalcanal, giving them critical warning time. The carrier planes attacked the incoming formation aggressively and destroyed many of the enemy bombers before they reached the fleet. But on this second day, United States ships did not escape completely unscathed as they had the first day. A blazing bomber, already fatally hit and trailing fire, deliberately dove directly into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott in a suicide crash and set the ship massively ablaze, flames consuming the superstructure. One dive bomber that penetrated the combat air patrol sent a torpedo slamming into the destroyer Jarvis. The explosion tore a massive hole in her hull and put her completely out of action, dead in the water. That morning, the planes from the Enterprise and other carriers took off on their assigned missions and initially found the skies eerily clear of enemy aircraft. They strafed and bombed Japanese troop concentrations along the Tenaru River and worked over the airfield again, cratering the runway. At approximately 10:08 a.m., 3 fighters from the Enterprise on patrol discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in dangerously low over the water surface to attack the vulnerable transports, trying to sneak in under radar. The Americans jumped them immediately. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 Zero fighter. Ensign V.H.H. Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers with accurate deflection shooting, and Ensign J.D. Shoemaker shot down another Betty. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed in minutes. That was the end of significant air activity for the day. The Japanese withdrew. At nightfall, the Enterprise's Fighting Squadron 6 counted its losses soberly. 6 pilots shot down and killed by Zeros that day. The Japanese Zero fighters still maintained a deadly edge in experience and aircraft performance, still extracted a heavy price. But American pilots were rapidly learning survival tricks. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group, studying the day's combat reports carefully, concluded that the Zero had 2 major exploitable weaknesses: limited firepower from its light machine guns and complete inability to withstand battle damage because of its ultralight construction and lack of armor. Because of the Zero's vastly superior rate of climb, turning maneuverability and fuel capacity giving it extended range. F-4F Wildcat pilots were explicitly warned to stick close together in pairs at all times. Never fight alone. When attacked, each 2-plane element should immediately set up a defensive scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other in coordinated weaves. Thus, the pair of F-4Fs could concentrate their superior combined firepower on any attacking Zero, while they knew their own armored planes could absorb an enormous amount of punishment and keep flying. Use strength against weakness. On the ground, Marines continued fighting fierce, determined Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, island by island. On Tulagi, they'd suffered 90 casualties, but finally took complete control of the island by the end of the second day through brutal close combat. The Japanese garrison of 250 men had fought literally to the end with fanatical determination. 200 men were killed in action. Only 3 surrendered alive, and the remaining handful swam the dangerous strait to Florida Island to continue fighting from there, refusing to accept defeat. On Gavutu and Tanambogo combined, the Marines suffered 250 casualties in the vicious fighting. But the 500-man Japanese garrison was completely wiped out to the absolute last man. Not one survivor. The islands secured at terrible cost. The fierceness and intensity of fighting on Tulagi stood in sharp, almost shocking contrast with the relatively easy advance of Marines on Guadalcanal itself. 2 completely different battles. There on Guadalcanal's main island, on the morning of August 8th, Marines reached the edge of the almost completed airport they would soon name Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine dive bomber pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. They were beginning to develop a dangerous contempt for the enemy, underestimating them. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one young Marine complained within hearing of Richard Tregaskis, the International News Service correspondent who'd courageously accompanied the invasion to report it. "All they do is run and hide in the jungle," the Marine added dismissively. On the surface, the Marines couldn't ask for an easier war, but the experienced officers remained edgy, nervous that second afternoon, instincts warning them. It seemed too easy, too simple, something felt wrong. At sea surrounding the island, the Americans apparently faced no serious opposition either initially. A few Japanese patrol craft, seaplane tenders, and 1 or 2 small transports had been caught off the shore completely by surprise, and they'd been systematically destroyed in the first chaotic hours of invasion by concentrated shelling and bombing sent to the bottom. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans serious pause for concern, testing them. Most of those first waves of bombers had been destroyed or driven off, but the cost of meeting and defeating the escorting Zeros had been 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes destroyed or damaged, more than 1/5 of his entire air group. That loss, though not particularly high by operational combat standards, absolutely convinced the nervous Fletcher that his earlier decision to withdraw the carriers was completely sound and justified. He'd been right to worry. At 6:12 p.m. that evening, Fletcher sent an urgent message to Admiral Gormley formally requesting permission to withdraw his precious carriers from the area immediately. Couldn't wait any longer. He actually began withdrawing before he'd even received a reply, already turning away. Priorities clear. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's outgoing dispatch aboard his command ship, he realized immediately with sinking dread that the carrier withdrawal would leave him completely without any air cover whatsoever. His transports and cargo ships would be sitting ducks for Japanese bombers. The number of Japanese aircraft could be expected to increase dramatically and sharply as the enemy brought additional planes down through the island chain from Truk and other bases, concentrating overwhelming air power. As Fletcher began his withdrawal, steaming east away from danger, the Japanese were already moving in force toward Guadalcanal, converging. When the word invasion had been frantically flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul early on August 7th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had reacted immediately with decisive action. Admiral Mikawa commanded the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, which meant he bore direct responsibility for the entire South Pacific operation, everything happening in this vast theater. His first instinctive move was to rapidly load 6 small transports with combat troops and dispatch them with destroyer escorts to reinforce the embattled 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. Get help to them quickly. But the small convoy ran directly into the American submarine S-38, which was operating aggressively out of Australia following the fall of the Philippines, still hunting. the S-38 torpedoed and sank the transport Meiyo Maru with 342 men trapped aboard, screaming as the ship went down. The sinking, coupled with increasingly alarming reports of the enormous size of the American invasion flotilla, hundreds of ships, persuaded Admiral Mikawa that it was far too dangerous at this moment to attempt reinforcing the garrison by slow transport. They'd all be sunk. He reluctantly called back the other 5 transports to safety, abandoning the garrison temporarily. But by that time, Japanese naval combat power was already racing toward Guadalcanal, steel and fury. Admiral Mikawa had been extraordinarily lucky in the critical matter of timing, forces available. Early on the morning of August 7th, precisely as the Tulagi garrison was sending its final desperate messages, 5 heavy cruisers had departed Kavieng on the northern tip of New Ireland on routine patrol. 3 of them were initially headed northeast toward Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul on regular rotation. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten immediately to Rabaul at maximum speed. Emergency recalled. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer for escort, steamed into Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin the formation. When she came racing up late that afternoon, she was carrying Admiral Mikawa himself aboard as flagship and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari for additional firepower. So the rapidly assembled Japanese striking force moved south toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers bristling with 8-inch guns, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, a powerful surface action group. As they sped south through darkening waters, Admiral Mikawa carefully composed his battle plan, thinking through every detail. By deliberately cutting speed slightly, they could carefully time their arrival until after midnight on August 8th and execute a surprise night attack on the American forces crowded at the beachhead. Catch them sleeping. Admiral Mikawa knew from intelligence reports that the Americans had several carriers operating in that area, providing air cover, while he had absolutely none. No air support whatsoever. A night attack represented an absolute guarantee that he wouldn't be harassed by American carrier planes. Since the Americans had virtually no record of proficiency whatsoever in night aerial operations, had never trained for it seriously. In fact, the Americans had no real record of competence in any sort of night naval surface operations. Night fighting wasn't emphasized in American naval doctrine. Meanwhile, this aspect of naval tactics had become a Japanese specialty, something they'd trained for extensively, practiced religiously, perfected. Mikawa's tactical problem that afternoon as he steamed south was how to move close enough to Guadalcanal without arriving too soon and revealing his presence, but still not give away the precious element of surprise he needed. He absolutely had to attack to support the desperate Guadalcanal defenders. That was his duty. But if he could achieve complete surprise, the effectiveness would be enormously magnified, potentially devastating. Admiral Mikawa didn't know it yet as he planned. But the fundamental nature of the divided American command structure, the persistent inferiority of American air intelligence systems and reconnaissance coordination, and the complete lack of clearly defined search procedures and responsibilities would all play directly into his hands like gifts, make his mission far easier. For reliable intelligence about Japanese ship movements and locations, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to depend almost entirely on air search patrols and submarine contact reports. Only under the most special and fortunate circumstances would reports from coast watchers be of much practical use concerning naval ship operations. They were positioned to watch air traffic primarily. Early in the day, on August 7th, the Japanese cruiser force had been spotted and reported by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved down toward Rabaul on what appeared to be routine patrol. On the evening of August 7th, the Mikawa force was spotted again by the submarine S-38, just as it emerged from St. George's Channel heading south, the submarine commander noting the course. That night, the commander of S-38 dutifully reported the contact to Brisbane headquarters in detail. But those two separate sighting reports were not given much credence or serious attention by American naval commanders in the operation, were essentially dismissed. Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's primary forward base in the region. Ships moved in and out constantly. It was the busiest port in the South Pacific. The Americans saw absolutely no clear indication that these particular ships in question were steaming with hostile intent directly toward Guadalcanal, rather than conducting routine movements. The reports seemed unremarkable. Admiral Gormley bore overall responsibility for coordination of all elements of the complex American attack. But to secure adequate air search coverage, he had to depend on several completely different and independent sources that didn't coordinate well. First were the long-range B-17 heavy bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Air Force, both part of MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command, which operated with complete independence from Navy control. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force scattered across multiple bases, which included a number of seaplane tenders and PBY Catalina patrol bombers for reconnaissance. General MacArthur's planes were assigned responsibility for search coverage of the Bismarck Islands, concentrating their limited resources on the big Japanese naval and air base complex at Rabaul. McCain's naval patrol planes were supposed to watch the northern approaches to the region, which meant Truk and the Marshall Islands, the main Japanese bases. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to conduct short-range tactical searches around the immediate invasion area, but actually made virtually none at all in practice. Fletcher was too worried about conserving his aircraft and fuel. Admiral Turner had carefully studied his navigation charts and immediately seen that the Japanese had a nearly perfect approach route to Guadalcanal, a natural highway through the islands. The route ran along the west coast of Bougainville, straight down between Choiseul Island and Vella La Vella, past Colombangara, then between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and finally between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast, a protected channel the entire way. Turner studied that lane on his charts and christened it the Slot, a name that would soon become infamous in American naval history, spoken with dread and respect. A graveyard for ships. On the morning of August 8th, according to the search plan, 4 PBY Catalinas were scheduled to fly from Endeni on a 700-mile-long triangular pattern whose apex reached the area around the Fiji Islands, searching westward. 6 additional PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu, Santo northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands, and terminate at a point slightly above the Bismarck Archipelago, but positioned far to the west of where the Japanese task force was actually steaming. 6 more PBYs would spread out from Maleta across the slot from Guadalcanal to search an area north and west of the channel, covering the obvious approach. 3 B-17 heavy bombers were assigned to search the area north of Guadalcanal on a separate patrol pattern. On the night of August 7th, when Admiral Turner carefully studied the detailed search plan for the following day with growing alarm, he discovered to his horror that the slot itself was completely uncovered by any search aircraft, a gaping hole in coverage. He immediately asked Admiral McCain specifically for a special dedicated search of that critical area the next day, emphasizing the urgent importance. But somehow, inexplicably, between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's distant headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Maleta, which would actually launch the patrol planes, the urgent message was lost in transmission, misrouted, never received or acknowledged. The special search was never conducted, never launched. Thus, on August 8th, the Americans had carelessly left completely uncovered the single most obvious approach route of any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal, the highway straight to the beachhead. Admiral Mikawa's cruiser force steamed south through the slot, completely undetected, invisible, moving steadily closer through afternoon and evening. The Japanese crews were at battle stations, guns loaded, torpedoes armed, every man tense with anticipation. As darkness fell completely over the Solomon Islands on the night of August 8th, the tropical air grew thick and heavy, oppressive. Aboard the American ships anchored off Guadalcanal and Tulagi, exhausted sailors tried to grab sleep between watch rotations. 2 days of continuous combat operations had drained everyone. The transport and cargo ships sat low in the water, still heavy with supplies not yet unloaded. Vulnerable targets. The screening cruisers and destroyers patrolled in assigned patterns, but coordination between the various groups remained poor, communications uncertain. Admiral Turner's amphibious force was divided into 2 groups separated by Savo Island, which sat like a dark sentinel in the middle of Sealark Channel. The northern group protected the Tulagi landings, the southern group covered Guadalcanal, and between them, Savo Island created a blind spot, a gap in coverage. 2 destroyers, the Blue and the Ralph Talbot, were assigned to patrol the entrances to the channel on either side of Savo Island, to provide early warning of any approaching enemy force. But their patrol patterns were poorly coordinated, and at certain points, both destroyers would be at the far ends of their patrol sectors simultaneously, leaving the channel approaches temporarily unwatched. The gate open. The American cruisers and destroyers had been at general quarters for most of 2 days, gun crews exhausted, and Admiral Turner had authorized Condition 2, allowing half the crews to rest while half remained on watch. A compromise between readiness and human endurance. In the humid darkness, men slumped against gun mounts and bulkheads, grabbed whatever sleep they could. The night was incredibly dark, no moon visible, heavy clouds obscuring the stars, visibility perhaps 500 yards at most, conditions perfect for the Japanese who'd trained extensively for exactly this scenario. At approximately 1 p.m. on August 9th, Admiral Mikawa's force approached the entrance to the slot at high speed, the ships cutting through calm water, wakes phosphorescent in the darkness. Japanese lookouts, trained to extraordinary levels of night vision proficiency, strained their eyes searching for American picket ships. The lead destroyer spotted the USS Blue patrolling the western entrance, but the Blue was at the far end of her patrol pattern, moving away, and incredibly, completely failed to detect the entire Japanese column passing within a few miles. The watch officers weren't paying sufficient attention, grew complacent. The Japanese force passed through the gateway like ghosts, undetected, unannounced, death approaching silently. Admiral Mikawa's ships entered Sealark Channel and split into 2 columns, heavy cruisers in one group, light cruisers and the destroyer in another, preparing to execute a perfectly planned pincer attack on the unsuspecting American ships. Japanese float planes, launched quietly from the cruisers earlier, circled high overhead, dropping flares that illuminated the American ships brilliantly against the dark water, silhouetting them perfectly for targeting. But the Americans assumed the planes were friendly, conducting routine operations never suspected. At 1:43 a.m., the Japanese opened fire suddenly from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated eruption of violence. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness like blinding white fingers, fixing on American ships, and immediately, salvos of 8-inch shells began falling with devastating accuracy. The Japanese gunnery was superb, practiced, deadly. The first target was the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, patrolling peacefully. Within minutes, she was hit by over 24 shells, turned into a flaming wreck, fires raging from bow to stern, dead in the water, her captain mortally wounded. The American cruiser Chicago, patrolling nearby, took a torpedo hit that blew off her bow, but miraculously remained afloat, limping. The destroyer Patterson managed to broadcast a warning. Warning! Warning! Strange ships entering harbor. Her radio operator frantically keying the message. But by then, it was far too late. The attack was already underway, the ambush sprung. The northern group of American cruisers, the Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, were completely surprised. crews scrambling from sleep to battle stations in confusion and darkness. The Japanese caught them perfectly silhouetted against the fires already burning on Guadalcanal's shore from earlier fighting, lit up like targets on a range. The Japanese heavy cruisers poured withering fire into them from close range, shells smashing through thin armor like paper, secondary explosions erupting inside the American ships. The Quincy tried desperately to fight back, her guns firing blindly into the darkness, but she was overwhelmed instantly, hit by over 60 shells in minutes. Massive fires consuming her, she began listing heavily. Her captain, mortally wounded on the bridge, remained at his post directing damage control until a shell exploded next to him, killing him instantly. The Quincy rolled over and sank at 2:35 a.m., taking hundreds of men with her into the dark depths. The Vincennes, Admiral Turner's flagship, tried to maneuver but was caught in crossfire from multiple Japanese cruisers simultaneously. Shells hitting her from both sides. No escape. Fires broke out across her entire length. Ammunition began exploding, and she too began to list dangerously. She sank at 2:50 a.m., bow pointing toward the sky, sliding beneath the waves. The Astoria fought the longest, her crew battling fires desperately, trying to save their ship, but the damage was too extensive, too many compartments flooded. She lingered until noon on August 9th before finally capsizing and sinking, the last victim of the massacre. In less than 1 hour of brutal combat, the Japanese had sunk 4 Allied cruisers. The Canberra, Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria damaged several others and killed over 1,000 American and Australian sailors, bodies floating in oil-covered water. Japanese losses were minimal. Some shell damage to a few cruisers, less than 100 casualties total, an incredibly lopsided victory. Admiral Mikawa had achieved one of the most decisive naval victories in history, a perfectly executed night attack that caught the enemy completely unprepared, destroyed them systematically. But then, incredibly, with the American transports and cargo ships completely helpless before him, sitting ducks crowded in the anchorage, Mikawa made a decision that would haunt him forever. He ordered his force to withdraw immediately, turn around, head back through the slot to safety. His reasons were logical from his perspective. Dawn was approaching. American carrier planes would be searching for him. He'd already accomplished his mission of destroying the screening force. But by withdrawing without attacking the transports, without destroying the supplies piled on the beaches, without bombarding the Marines ashore, he left the American invasion fundamentally intact, wounded but surviving. If he'd pressed the attack for another 2 hours, he could have destroyed the entire American amphibious force, turned Guadalcanal into a complete disaster, possibly changed the entire course of the Pacific War. Instead, he withdrew, and the Americans, though bloodied and shocked, remained ashore, remained in possession of the nearly completed airfield, remained in the fight. The Battle of Savo Island, as it would be called, was the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy, measured by ships lost in a single action. A humiliating disaster that exposed every weakness in American doctrine, training, coordination, and leadership. Admiral Fletcher's carriers, which might have pursued and destroyed Mikawa's force in daylight, were already far to the east, withdrawing as Fletcher had promised, unavailable. Admiral Turner, learning of the disaster at dawn, realized immediately he had no choice. Without the carriers to provide air cover, without the cruisers to provide protection, he had to withdraw the transports and cargo ships immediately, or risk losing them all to Japanese air attack. On August 9th, the remaining American ships pulled away from Guadalcanal, leaving the Marines ashore with only about half the supplies they needed, only 4 days of rations, limited ammunition, incomplete equipment. General Vandegrift watched the ships steam away toward the horizon with sinking dread, realizing his Marines were now alone, isolated, cut off on a hostile island with a partially built airfield and an enemy that would certainly return in force. The first American offensive of the Pacific War had begun in chaos, survived a near-catastrophic defeat, and now hung by the thinnest thread, success or failure balanced on a knife's edge. The Marines on Guadalcanal looked at each other in the tropical heat and humidity, looked at the jungle pressing in from all sides, looked at the supplies stacked inadequately on the beach, and realized they were in this fight alone now, abandoned by the Navy that had brought them here. What they didn't know yet, couldn't know, was that the Battle of Guadalcanal would continue for 6 more months, would become the turning point of the entire Pacific War, would cost thousands of lives on both sides in brutal combat on land, at sea, and in the air. The airfield they'd captured, Henderson Field, would become the most contested piece of real estate in the world, fought over with desperate savagery. The waters around Savo Island would become known as Iron Bottom Sound. So many ships from both sides would be sunk there that their hulls would litter the ocean floor like a submerged graveyard of steel. The Japanese would pour reinforcements into Guadalcanal, determined to retake it, and the Americans would hold on with equal determination, neither side willing to yield, both sides bleeding in the tropical jungle. That humid morning of August 9, 1942, watching the American ships disappear over the horizon, the Marines couldn't know any of that yet. They just knew they were alone on a hostile island, that the Japanese would be coming back, and that they'd have to hold Henderson Field no matter what the cost. Because if they lost it, they lost everything, the entire offensive, possibly the war itself. The guns might have fallen silent temporarily as Admiral Mikawa's victorious force steamed away through the slot toward Rabaul. But their echoes would resound across the Pacific for months to come. A battle that changed everything, a defeat that ultimately led to victory, a disaster that somehow became the beginning of the end for Japanese ambitions in the South Pacific. Though nobody on either side understood that yet, on that dark morning after Savo Island, the bloodiest night battle in American naval history finally over. The real battle for Guadalcanal only just beginning. The memories of World War II remind us not only of the price of freedom, but of the strength of the human spirit. Let us preserve their stories so they are never forgotten. Please subscribe to help keep these memories alive.